started so we can give Randy a full complement of time. I'm Jim Hayes. I work with the Nature Conservancy here in Kansas. And welcome to Konza Prairie. Randy Rogers has been a long-time ecologist, prairie ecologist, biologist, colleague. He worked with the state of Kansas for many years. He's published numerous things. He's written chapters in books, and we're pleased to have him here. He's got a lot of slides to go through, so we'll get with Randy right now. So Randy Rogers.
Okay, thanks, Jim. I would have let you go through the full list, but I know it would have only taken about 2 seconds longer. So. This is, of course, the Shortgrass Session, but I'm not really going to be talking about Shortgrass Prairie. I'm going to be talking about this critter, the lesser prairie chicken, that exists within the Shortgrass Prairie region, but doesn't actually use a lot of short grass. Some of you are probably familiar with all the controversy surrounding the lesser prairie chicken right now. You know, it's been recently listed by the Fish and Wildlife Service as a threatened species, and it's become very political, and the states of Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, and I believe New Mexico are all suing the Fish and Wildlife Service for having listed the species. Well, I don't want to get in too deep, but I am going to hit on some of the reasons why I think that the politicians are barking up the wrong tree. That's a poor term to use. Anyway.
Prairie talk.
Yeah. Anyway, like I said, they exist in the shortgrass region of the southern plains, but they don't really use shortgrass. They use several different types of habitats that are embedded within that region. One of them is the sand sage prairie. It's a particular type of sagebrush that dominates certain sandy areas. Another is the shinnery oak prairie. This is actually an oak that in much of its range is just literally shin high. Presumably that's the reason, why it's called that. Mixed grass prairie, which is out in that country, a lot of little blue stem, cytosgrama, that sort of thing. But a little bits of tall grass prairie, or tall grass species as well, and short grass species. And one of the least known is the sand prairie, of which Kansas really is the only state that has any left. Well, we may have had the only sand prairie within the lesser prairie chicken range in the first place. But anyway, so when you talk about the history of the lesser prairie chicken, you can only go back, unfortunately, to European use of this country. We have to assume that the Indians had to have been as captivated by this species as anybody who's ever seen it. But we really don't have any kind of records as to how they interacted with it. Now, this is kind of a very generalized best guess as to what we think has happened to the species over the last 150 years or so. The early European explorers didn't encounter them all that much. But what they did find was that they were just in certain areas. They were not ubiquitous across the whole range. And so what I'm going to do is take you on a little bit of a journey over time and space. But one of the things I wanted to hit on again is this listing deal. The people that are really upset about the listing have used the suggestion that is the only reason the birds are down is because of severe drought that hit us really, it started in 2010 and running through early last year. Well, yeah, it hurt the birds badly, but that is by far only just a small fraction of the problem. So anyway, that is what the politicians are talking about, but we got a whole lot of other things that have happened since. Now, this is just a generalized graph of the historic range and what's left. And about 90% of the historic range is no longer occupied. Much of what is occupied is degraded. But what I'm going to do, again, is take you on a little bit of a journey with this critter and go over what has happened since the mid-18th century, or actually a little bit later than that. In the 1870s, actually the late 1860s, there was a treaty. I grew up in Medicine Lodge, you know where that is, here in Kansas, and there was a treaty signed called the Treaty of Medicine Lodge, and supposedly all the hunting rights for bison and everything else south of the Arkansas River. I have a hard time saying Arkansas. I still want to say Arkansas. But anyway, south of there were to go to the Indians. Well, that didn't last very long. The treaty was broken, and in the 1870s, the bison were pretty much wiped out. And that was one of the factors that actually played into what happened to the lesser prairie chicken early on. That, of course, allowed for primitive farming to come in. And so what we had was kind of what we think we had anyway, is kind of a conjugation of probably the grass that was out there was able to grow a little bit taller because the bison had been wiped out, but they still didn't have a lot of cattle on the range yet. And there were these scattered grain farms around that provided more food. And so what happened, and this part is very well documented, is the populations of lesser prairie chickens really exploded. And there were tremendous numbers of them for about 4 decades, enough to support market hunting. There are records of the rail companies, pulling up iced rail cars into these little towns in Texas, and sportsmen going out and shooting thousands of them, and they ship them back northeast. There's no evidence that the hunting itself caused the populations to decline. But anyway, there was this period of great abundance of about 4 decades through at least the first couple of decades of the 1900s. Then, of course, came along the Dust Bowl, and this was not just a sudden thing. Of course, the amount of farming continued to increase more and more, and more cattle were out there and overgrazing the land. And so you had a situation when drought came along. Then, of course, this is a colorized version of the type of pictures that we've all seen, where just walls of dust would come across the landscape. And that was hard on people, it was hard on cattle, it was hard on everything. In Kansas, there were probably, at least as far as records show, there were just a couple of very small populations left. They were nearly lost in New Mexico, low numbers in Oklahoma and Texas. We don't really have any records from Colorado. So that was the dirty 30s where they hit a real low. From here on out, I am mostly going to talk about this period in here, where we saw some partial recovery, and then followed by what I'm just calling incremental decline. And to do that, what I want to do is not so much go over time as take you around the range through using pictures from Google Earth. And so what I've done is I've just roughly outlined a Google Earth image of the northern 3/4 of the range. And what we're going to do is we're going to fly around different places and look at different things as to what has happened to the lesser prairie chicken range. So the first place we're going to go is right down there in southwest Kansas and southeastern Colorado to the Cimarron National Grasslands and the Comanche National Grasslands. These places came about because of the Dust Bowl. A lot of that land was farmed. Most of it was farmed. And there were documentation of people saying you could stand here and look all the way to the Colorado line and see no vegetation at all except for an occasional bit of sagebrush. Really grim situation. So the federal government came in and started purchasing these farms in some of the most critical areas, and that became these two grasslands. What I most want you to recognize, though, is while there may be 150,000 acres of lesser prairie chicken habitat between the two of them, these are small areas awash in agriculture, surrounded by huge swaths of agriculture. And that's what again, the sand sage prairie on the Cimarron National Grassland looked like a long time ago when I took this picture. Now, let's move up to the Garden City area. And of course what you see are all kinds of dots there. Those are center pivot irrigation systems. And this area really got, this whole area was sand sage prairie. Big, huge area of sand sage. And basically in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, about 6% of the sand sage was being developed per year and converted to center pivots. Had it not been for the fact that they were worried about running out of groundwater, that these other small areas would have been converted as well. That's a little bit of a long story, which I won't get into, but it's essentially a groundwater control use area was established that they would not allow any more drilling of water wells. And now we'll look what's within that circle right there. This is the Sunflower Electric Power Plant. And again, you can just gives you another perspective on how much of that land has been developed. There are still a few lesser prairie chicken leks in this swath right here. But again, much of the range is very fragmented. And so, but you know, center pivot irrigation systems were one of the things that came along that really, you know, decimated lesser prairie chicken populations, because that land, that sandy soil, could not really be farmed prior to the invention of this stuff. And so those were really good refuge areas for the species, even though a lot of the tighter soils had been farmed for years. Once these came along, then we lost a lot of the prime sandy soil sites. Now let's move over south of Great Bend into another large area of sandy soil. This was all sand prairie. In my opinion, some of the very best lesser prairie chicken habitat that we've probably ever had historically. But there's only just a little swath of it right in here now. This is a little bit, this is Edwards County, and here's northern Kiowa County. We'll take a look at that area right there. And you know, there are still very good numbers of lesser prairie chickens in this area, density-wise. But again, it's a small swath. And this is a little what the sand prairie looks like. One thing I will point out, and we'll get into this a bit more later though, is there are trees invading that area, and the prairie chickens are not tolerant of that. Let's just move to another area, southwest Amarillo. Same thing. You know, I won't belabor the point. You get the idea. These were some of the best last places until pivot irrigation came along. And of course, the pivot irrigation facilitated the growth of confined animal feeding, you know, units, feedlots, hog farms. This is another aerial of a hog farm I pulled off the internet. This may not actually be in lesser prairie chicken range, but anyway. you get the idea. And so the juxtaposition of groundwater and that inexpensive sandy soil rangeland is one of the things that really hurt lesser prairie chickens. But other underground resources have made a big impact on them as well. And that is what we'll look at in the Permian Basin area. In this case, we'll look mostly west of Lubbock out into the western Panhandle and eastern New Mexico. Here's Lubbock right here. And let's just kind of take a look at some of this rangeland right in here. The lighter soils are croplands. The lighter colors are croplands. So we'll look at this area right here. And, you know, from high altitude, looks like, yeah, there's probably still quite a bit of habitat out there. But, oh, what are all these little specks? We'll look at that area. It's not a housing development. That's oil pumps. And of course the, pumping facilities or processing facilities that go along with it. That's what a lot of those fields look like. They just pump after pump after pump. And they're vast areas that are like this. This is eastern New Mexico. And again, if you look carefully, you start to see the little specks in there. We'll zero in on this area. This is actually Bureau of Land Management land. And this was prairie chicken habitat at one time, but of course they can't tolerate that kind of development. Just another quick example. This is, well actually, let's just go ahead and do that. The Nature Conservancy has about 13,000 acre chunk of ground just north and west of the little town of Milne Sand. It's not even really a town, it's a store. It's mostly shinnery oak habitat. But again, if you look carefully, you'll see that it is isolated. There's oil and gas here, oil and gas here, oil and gas out here, cropland up here. There are just not a lot of big chunks left. And oil and gas issues are not just confined to the Permian Basin. This is western Oklahoma, and I think it's interesting that this is the Pack Saddle Wildlife Area that is managed by the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation, and yet they have so much oil and gas on it that my understanding is there are few, if any, lesser prairie chickens left. And this is an area that was at one time really excellent lesser prairie chicken habitat. But in a state like Oklahoma, you don't say no to oil and gas. It's just politically not doable. Here's another area, the Cooper Wildlife Area is right up there northwest of Woodward, Oklahoma. And here we don't see a great deal of oil and gas, so there is quite a bit in the area. But you do see some disturbances here. And I wanted to zero in on the one on the right there a little bit. It kind of looks like oil pads, but if you look carefully, you'll see these shadows sticking out. Those are wind turbines just off the Cooper Wildlife Area. And that's actually a picture of the wind turbines that are just northwest of the Cooper Wildlife Area. And at the time they were putting in a pipeline through there when I went through. So again, more and more habitat being lost. This is also still the Cooper Wildlife Area, and thankfully they are doing some burning on the area. But I wanted to point out all this this green, not so much, well, the black was done to prevent some of that green coming in. The green is eastern red cedar invasion. Perfectly wonderful sand sage prairie here, ruined effectively for grassland birds because of eastern red cedar encroaching. Not enough historic burning. That's one of the things European people have done, is prevented fire on the prairie. And so this is I like to use the term of metastasizing cancer on the prairie, because it's not spreading in the front. It gets a little hold here, a little hold there, and spreads out from those very rapidly. And the problem is people don't recognize the problem when the trees are this big. They have to see them this big, and then they say, oh, we have a problem. As I might have mentioned to somebody, I grew up in Medicine Lodge, so we'll go over into the Red Hills area. High altitude photo of what was once mostly good lesser prairie chicken habitat. But that's, you know, these areas are just infested with eastern red cedar. That's just west of my hometown. There is some good news though. You'll see a very sharp demarcation here. This is the Z-Bar Ranch in southwestern Barber County. And when this land was first changed hands most recently, a lot of this over here looked like this, and they have worked very, very hard to change that landscape and bring it back, and they're doing a really good job. But there's still a lot of pockets of eastern red cedar. The situation basically is there's good news out there. There are people that are doing good things, but there's a lot of bad news too. And I'm telling you, so far I've told you a lot about the bad news. But shifting a little bit more to the good news, you just go 20 miles northwest into southeastern Kiowa County, and there's a ranch, well, several ranches out there, but we'll focus in on this one. If you look at that landscape, of course this is an aerial, and it's just wonderful. It's almost treeless, very, very well managed. It's being managed with hatch burning, which I won't get into here, but it's really excellent practice. And just glorious prairie. So there are still some really wonderful places out there that people are doing a really good job. We just need a whole lot more people doing the good things. Finally, we'll shift up to one of the biggest success stories that has come along for lesser prairie chickens. This is up in west central Kansas. Back in 1985, the Congress passed what's called the Conservation Reserve Program, which some of you may well be familiar with. And essentially that allowed farmers to take some of their least productive croplands out of cropping and put them back into grass. And what happened in Kansas was that a decision was made that that grassland would be ceded to native species. And that's what a lot of the stuff in western Kansas looked like, which frankly doesn't look so different from some of the pictures that we showed you. I just showed you some of the better stuff. Well, what we found was that a lot of the stuff that was enrolled in the Conservation Reserve Program, which are these tan-colored splotches, were directly adjacent to the native rangeland that was still there. Much of that was a little bit shorter. But what it did is create a mosaic of grass that was probably knee-high next to grasslands that were a little bit shorter. And what happened over the course of about 10 years after that grass was planted is that lesser prairie chickens just exploded in that area. And these are leks, most of which I found myself way back when, that, you know, probably weren't there prior to CRP. We can't say that there were no birds in this part of the state, but the population just grew tremendously. And so you can see these more pinkish areas. That's the CRP grassland versus the native prairie, which was here. This is the Smoky Hill River right here in Gove County. So some research was done, and much, much more is being done. But the early indications were that what the birds were doing primarily was they were using the CRP for nesting cover and taking their chicks over to the native grass across the fence to raise their brood, because there was a lot more broadleaf plants over here, and the broadleaves provide better brood habitat. But if we had a good amount of forbs in the CRP stands, then it could do both. It could be both good nesting and good brood habitat. Unfortunately, Kansas was the only state in the Lesser Prairie Chicken Range that used native grass species to establish these conservation reserve grasslands. In Texas, in Oklahoma, and New Mexico, that's not quite true, Colorado did too. But in those three states, Old World blue stems were used. And these species, both yellow blue stem and Caucasian blue stem, have proven to be of very little, if any, value to lesser prairie chickens and other grassland birds. What's more, they are very invasive, and we now see that they are threatening even some of our better managed native grasslands. So this is a real danger, as much or more than trees. But it's a little more difficult to see because, you know, a tree is obviously something that's separate out there on the prairie. This stuff is more insidious because you can't, unless you really know what you're looking for, you can't see it. So, basically, getting back to the idea that all of our problems with lesser prairie chickens have been caused by the recent drought, and if it just rains, everything will be fine. I want to reiterate, about 90% of the range is gone, and much of the remaining part of the range is degraded either through agriculture or energy developments, tree invasion, which is the result of fire suppression that has been going on for way over 100 years. Or just plain shitty land management. You know, basically, forgive me, that's a poor term, but you know, there are a lot of places within the range where overgrazing is still a huge issue. And you know, you have grasslands that look like that. Yes, this was exacerbated by the drought, but that's not the only story that is. Just it's really been long-term abuse. And so, you know, basically the question is, where are we going from here? And there is a legitimate debate, frankly, as to whether the listing of the species was the best way to bring the population back up. But there should be no debate as to whether the species is in trouble and actually is biologically threatened. The debate is a political one, and that is it better for the federal government to try to bring the population back up, or is it better for the states to try to bring the population back up? As it is working now, there's actually kind of a coalition of the two working together, and there's a management plan underway where the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies has a plan essentially that is incentivizing and disincentivizing certain practices out on the land. Keep in mind that 95% of this land is privately owned land. And so essentially they're the plan is that it's making it financially difficult to develop in some areas that are really sensitive for our remaining lesser prairie chicken populations, and it's taking that money and using it to incentivize good management in other places. So basically the oil and gas industry, the energy industries are being asked to pay for lesser prairie chicken population, or population management. Needless to say, there are many who are not happy about that. So that is the reason a lot of this controversy is out there. But when you have a species that is legitimately in trouble, 95% of them are on private lands, it's bound to be a controversial issue. So, you know, I think with that plan and a long-term effort, there is still hope for this species. It's a tremendous, iconic species, and they're just fabulous to watch. As any of you have ever seen greater prairie chickens, well, lessers are just as cool. Personally, I think they're cooler. That's because I live out there. Yeah. What's really neat is to watch both species on the same lek. There is some overlap of about 40 miles.
Could you comment a little bit about hybridization? That is an issue, is it not?
It is an issue. I personally don't think it's a big issue. Historically, the species undoubtedly overlapped and undoubtedly interbred to some degree. We have in western Kansas about a 40-mile wide area where the species overlap, and it's about maybe 100 miles long. And from what we have seen through surveys since they were first started out there, this was after the CRP population growth out there, the hybrid populations are staying pretty steady at 2 to 3% of the overall. So that would not, in my mind, suggest that this is a real issue. I think the habitat issues far and away overwhelm, are far more important. And so personally, Dave may disagree with me, but personally I think that is not a problem. You disagree with me? Oh, good. All right.
Ray, we need to stop there.
Okay, thank you.
I would have had one or two more questions in case you have a question that's just burning. I'll let Randy answer a couple more. Other than that,
Okay.
Randy will be here the rest of the day. He has one more presentation here after bed, but he'll be floating around in case you want to get with him.